Alright, let's look at multiplying and dividing real numbers. Now before we start, we need to look at a few properties that we've used before, but you may not have realized it was an actual property. Now the first one is the identity property of multiplication. That's just saying for every number, let's say n, if you multiply it by 1, it's going to be the same thing. So if I multiply 5 by 1, it's 5. If I multiply -4 by 1, it's -4. So it's not actually going to change the number. Now the second one is the multiplication property of zeros. This is just saying if you multiply a number by 0, the answer is 0. So if I do 6 times 0, that's going to be 0. Or -14 times 0, that's going to be 0. So the last one is multiplication property of -1. So it's saying for every real number n, if you do n times -1, you're just going to get the opposite of what n was. So if I do -1 times 5, then I'm going to get -5. If I do -1 times -4, I'll get a +4. It's taking the opposite of that -4. Alright, when multiplying and dividing real numbers, what we need to remember, if they are the same signs, like 2 positive or negative and a negative, then you're always going to have a positive answer. Now if they're different signs, you're going to have a negative answer. So like -10 times -15, that is going to be, that should be a -5. That is going to be 50 because 2 negatives, same sign, positive answer. The second one, 4 times -6, different sign, so I'm going to get a different negative answer. And 4 times 6 is 24, so my answer is going to be -24. Now number 3, this happens not only we use these rules for multiplication, but also for division. So if I do -6 divided by 3, different signs, I'm going to get a negative number. 3 goes into 6 2 times, so my answer is -2. When we get to having 3 or multiple numbers multiplying together, if you have an even number of negatives, like this one, I have a -2 and -4, that's 2 negative numbers, you're going to get a positive answer. If you have an odd number of negatives, like say if this 2 was also negative, that would be 3 negatives and I would get a negative answer. But this one, I do 2 times -2, which is -4. Now I take this number and multiply it by -4. And 2 negatives multiplied together give me a positive 16. Now number 5, -9 divided by -3. Both of these are negative, so it automatically makes the answer a positive number. And we know -3 goes into -9 3 times. So let's look at the inverse property of multiplication. Now this is saying for every real number a, there is a multiplicative inverse 1 over a, such that if you do a times 1 over a, it's going to give you 1. And a lot of times we call this the reciprocal. So if I do 5 times the inverse, which would be 1 over 5, multiply these two together, I'm going to get 1. If I do the same thing but they're both negative, I also get 1. So my multiplicative inverse is also what we call the reciprocal. And we'll use reciprocal more than we will multiplicative inverse, because that is a big word. So when we are dividing using the reciprocal that we just learned, is just like dividing fractions. So if I want to evaluate x divided by y, I'm going to say x is -3/4 and y is -5/2. So I put this together. X over y is the same thing as x divided by y. Both two ways to write the same problem. So I plug in -3/4 for x and -5/2 for y. Now remember, when we're dividing fractions, we keep the first the same. We change the division sign to the multiplication sign, and we take the reciprocal of this. So if it's negative 5/2, then I flip the fraction and make it negative 2/5. This is the multiplicative inverse, which is also called the reciprocal. So now I multiply across. Negative 3 times negative 2 is a positive 6. 4 times 5 is 20. Now, you're in algebra, so we know that 6/20 is not a simplified fraction, and we only write fractions in simplest form. So both the top and bottom can be divided by 2, and that would give me 3/10, and 3/10 is a simplified fraction in its simplest form. So we're going to look at the following examples. This one, same one, x divided by y. This time my x is going to be 2/5 and my y is going to be 3/10. So I plug it in. 2/5 divided by 3/10. Remember, keep the first fraction the same. Division becomes multiplication, and then use the reciprocal of 3/10, which is 10/3. Multiply across. 2 times 10 is 20. 5 times 3 is 15. Now 20/15 is not a simplified fraction, so when I simplify it, both of them, 5 goes into. 20, 5 goes into 4 times, and 15, 5 goes into 3 times. So 4/3, 4/3, which is also 1 1/3. You can write it either way. It's the correct answer. Alright, this next one, I have negative 3m, all that divided by t. We're going to say 5/6 is m, and 1/6 is t. So, I write it all out. Now, notice order of operations, we've got to do this negative 3 times 5/6 first. When we are multiplying fractions, remember we do negative 3 times 5, which is negative 15. And remember, negative 3 is like the fraction negative 3/1, so it would be 1 times 6 is 6. Now I can divide by 1/6. So, what I need to do, keep the negative 15/6 the same. Change the division to multiplication. Take the reciprocal of 1/6, which is 6/1, or 6. Now I multiply. Notice, before you multiply, you could do one of two things. You can simplify it right now. You notice that 6 and 6, both of these could reduce down to 1. And then you do negative 15 times 1, and you get negative 15 for your answer. Or you can go ahead and multiply it out. So negative 15 times 6 is negative 90. And 6 times 1 is 6. Now negative 90/6 can be simplified. And that can be simplified to negative 15, which will be your answer.